what will be your commentary generally about the situation as it is beginning to develop? We will deal with the specifics of the law shortly.
Yeah. I mean, I think generally one of the things that we've glossed over, I think, is that we ought to be grateful that we are seeing, to some extent, a demilitarization of our democracy and the process. That, for me, we cannot gloss over. If the military were involved in the way in which they were in past elections, I think we would have lost a lot of lives. So I hear, my senior Frank talk about how scary the events were. But one of the things that he mentioned that reassures me is that cooler heads prevailed because civilians were involved, and that there were some party leadership as well were involved in the process, and we didn't see some of the things that happened. Now, my biggest challenge is that the way in which we talk about public participation in our elections, it's almost as if we consider it as threatening rather than legitimizing. And I believe that public presence in our elections legitimizes the elections. Now, it is important that we count the election results in public, in light. We should not collate in darkness. Now, when you go to CI 127, it recognizes the right of the public to be present where we are counting. We had over nearly 41,000 police stations during the elections. Across all these police stations, for the vast majority of them, the ballots were counted in the presence of people. In fact, the proximity of most people to where the counting was done was very, very close. Police presence there could not have stopped individuals from interfering in the process if they wanted to. But that did not happen. Now, why is this happening around collation? Tells you that the problem is not that people are present. The problem is that the ways in which we are setting up the collation process does not engender the same level of openness and trust that it should engender. So if the thinking then is that, okay, collations are going to be able to attract people, police stations do. We need to set up the space in a way that is inviting to the people because their presence and their view of it legitimizes the process. Now, even in terms of the conversation we're having now, we've seen so many police officers deployed to the place. And if we are anticipating that people are going to be there, the idea should not be that the only way in which we can go about this securitizing the process is to overwhelm people with police presence. We can't do that if the majority of people show that. Why not set up giant screens for people to watch what is happening in the collation room? Why not televise the process? So the public will be invited in to demystify what is happening in the collation process. That, for me, is those techniques that have not been deployed effectively to ensure that people can have a clear view of what is happening to be able to trust that this is going according to how they should go to. And that's what we haven't seen as much of. Now, in the process that has happened, in some of the conversations that have happened in the past regarding the authority of the EC to collate or re-collate as the conversation is going. And here I am a bit, well, first of all, let me say that I was in court yesterday, and I was sat in, well, not sat in the gallery, standing in the gallery because we had no place to sit. And I am unable to accept any suggestion that the view of the High Court judge was wrong.
You are unable to
unable to accept that the view was wrong.
That the judge was wrong?
Yes. And I'll say why. The process of compiling elections and declaring that is an administrative duty. And in that process, an administrative body is allowed the room and grace to make mistakes and correct mistakes. We cannot have, and our democracy does not benefit from the idea that once a pronouncement is made, there and there on the spot, you are bound by what has been said then, and you cannot correct it. I don't agree with that view. Perhaps the difficulty we're having is not that the law, that's what the law says, but that the EC has taken that posturing in the past. And if the EC has failed to be consistent on that issue, this is what has created the kind of conversation we have had. If in the past it said that if you have a challenge with what we have declared, let's recollate, then it's not a problem. In fact, the law allows us to recount. When a count is challenged, you're allowed to recount again. You can even demand a second recount until the presiding officer refuses, thinks that, no, it's unreasonable. And even then, when we go to collation center, the law says that the returning officer shall recount. So there's almost a three-step recounting process. And I don't see why recollation cannot be done as many times
I
as
think it's supposed to be a two-step.
It's a two-step.
You, at the polling station, you have one opportunity.
You have two opportunities, actually. Okay. So you have two opportunities under the law. But then if the officer there thinks that is unreasonable,
that's right,
it goes to collation, and then
the returning officer will ensure the recount. At the collation center.
At the collation center.
Okay.
So that's how it is. And I think that even in terms of the collation process, if the EC has made a declaration, which in its own view, administratively, it says that we got a number of things wrong, let's do that. I am always more concerned about what is the future integrity of our elections. That if the view is taken that anything said binds, it means that all you have to do is that get an individual, as scrupulous as however the person may be, and then declare anything. And we say that, okay, now go to court. I don't think that's fair. Now, the process is more the trust rather than, because if what is being done at Re-Collation is a counting process, to be honest, and the count is not correct by whatever accurate measure, then the ballots are there, let's recount. So the process is not, the question is not about the recounting, it's whether or not there's a trust in the boxes which are there. So let's recenter them as to where the proper questioning should be.
Because there are claims of foreign material,
yes,
so to speak.
Absolutely.
Sheets and so on popping up at some of the places.
And that has been my concern, that I am not hearing enough about what the opposition now has talked about, several instances where they have stopped swap of ballot boxes or people who have printed extra. I am not seeing conversation about if there was an organized attempt to disrupt or rig our elections. We need to have that conversation rather than sweep it out of the carpet.
Okay.
I think last week on Newsfile, there was this conversation which was being had about electoral offenses are offenses too. So if there's an organized attempt to rig the election, then let's go into that.
Right.
And if we don't get at that, then you're going to have the kind of problems I think we're seeing.
I'm sure later Frank Davis will come in on this, but this is the question to you, that the EC chairperson is the returning officer for the presidential election.
Yeah.
So somehow she has limited influence on what the returning officer for the parliamentary elections can do.
Yeah.
And by the law, in sections, regulations 43 thereabouts,
yes,
in the CI 127, is the returning officer's job,
yeah,
to ensure that the collation is done and the one who has won is declared. The arguments that once the collation is done and declaration is over, you cannot have a re-collation and a new declaration. You are saying it doesn't matter, it should matter that if, like the EC says, the collation process or the purported declaration was procured by intimidation, the duress, acts of some crime, then the EC should have the power to recollate and redeclare.
Yeah.
That's your point?
Yes, that's my view. I mean, I think that the EC as a whole has an administrative oversight over returning officers. The returning officer's job is only to return the results to us. The entire processes and integrity of the elections belongs to the EC to manage. Now, if the EC has that view, or says we make even an arithmetic mistake, they're entitled to make that correction, I believe.
I'm sure people will not begrudge them for an arithmetic mistake.
Yes. Now, the questions as to the allegations that they are made, actually very serious allegations. And I do think that in terms of the people we should be hearing from at this stage should be the relevant returning officers directly.
Right.
And perhaps that is important. And I say this on two counts. There's, of course, the legal issue as to who is the proper authority, who's the returning officer for these elections. But also in terms of the credibility of the EC chair itself, which is that there's so much dispute around here that it benefits our democracy to give the voices to those who are directly on the ground than taking center.
We don't know exactly what the accuracy of this situation is, but we are told that in one of the constituencies in, is it Damango or somewhere, in the northern region, there was the declaration was done by an officer other than the returning officer. And the EC's Bosman Asari told me on Newsfire last week that they authorized him to do it in place of the returning officer. And the NDC says, you accept that result. It wasn't declared by the returning officer, but you dispute the results. You say you don't accept the results for Tema Central or one other place, which was not declared by the returning officer, but allegedly declared by a returning officer for another constituency, who is also the EC's officer. And I'm going to, forgive me, Reverend Fred Degbe and Dr. John Osakwapong, because there's a legal issue coming up and I think they should address it quickly. So what becomes the effect of sections 19, 20 of the Representation of the People law. It says that the election of a candidate shall be declared void on an election petition if the High Court is satisfied that these things have happened. These are the things the NDC is saying. The EC says have happened at these declarations. And if they have happened, the only place for them to be resolved is the High Court and never the EC. So it says if the court is satisfied that there has been general bribery, general treating, general intimidation. Note that, it's important. Intimidation, because that's what the EC is saying. Intimidation or other misconduct or circumstances, whether similar to those specified in this law or not, have so extensively prevailed that they may have reasonably supposed to have affected the results of the election. Listen to this one too. That there has been non-compliance with any provision of this law or of regulations made under this law, and that it appears that the election was not conducted in accordance with the principles laid down by the law, and that such non-compliance affected the results of the election. The EC says these constituencies, they need to re-collate. The declarations and collations were made in breach and were not compliant with CI 127. This provision says if there is non-compliance with CI 127 or any other law, this is the court that is supposed to pronounce. And finally, that I'll just add one more. There are a couple of them. That a corrupt or illegal practice was committed in connection with the election by the candidate or with his knowledge or consent. So what will you say?
Well, the first one is that, 3 points. The first one is that in respect of the EC's lack of consistency, I've said that's been a problem. I believe that by this...
Because she pointed them to this law in 2020.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that even in terms of them and go now, as we're talking about, that the EC ought to accept that there needs to be a re-declaration in that space as well, or re-collation or whatever it is, to be consistent across board as it's applying, which is what we're not seeing happen. Respect to the High Court's jurisdiction, I think that the High Court's jurisdiction is only invoked on the final voice or say of the Electoral Commission, meaning that what it is eminently gazetted should be the basis of jurisdiction, I believe. But even in...
Because a petition can be filed only within 21 days after the gazette.
Gazetting, yes. Now, even in law, the first point we need to understand is that it is the institution which has the responsibility to ensure compliance with law. That if it feels that compliance of law has not been done, nothing precludes it from going back and ensuring that compliance. That is why you have situations where you go to court and then they tell you that the matter has become moot. Because the institution has done the right thing.
Right.
So this is why I believe that the EC is consistently entitled to ensure that all the actions comply with law and prevent this from happening.
Or that sometimes they don't tell you that the matter is smooth. They tell you that you should have exhausted the internal process before you come to the court. All right.
So that's why I believe that the institution retains that legal space to ensure that all its actions are compliant with law.
All right.
And if it feels or determines that it hasn't happened, nothing stops us or stops that institution from correcting that mistake.
Right. A couple of issues coming.